the central problem with DMT, our inability to explain how the brain is able to construct these realities that are so different to the normal waking world with such adroit, with such effortless precision and ability. And it's a remarkable thing. Unless there is some kind of alternate sensory information input. Is the brain picking up, or is information being inputted into your brain from somewhere else?
Andrew Gallimore is a neurobiologist, pharmacologist, and author with a new book on DMT coming out this July.
Rick has a colleague called Andrew Gallimore, who teaches at the University of Okinawa in Japan. And Rick and Andrew have together developed a technology for releasing DMT into human volunteers in a very slow drip that will keep them in the DMT state, if they wish, for hours.
In this interview, Andrew lays out the history, science, and subjective experience of DMT while talking about why it's so mysterious and unique compared to other psychedelics.
The classic psychedelics, they nudge the dial just out of tune a little bit. But with DMT, what happens is that the model is completely obliterated. And it's like you've found a completely new channel. The brain stops constructing the normal waking world model in its entirety. It's gone, and suddenly starts to construct this entirely novel, completely alien model. It's a completely different world model. Your brain is constructing an entirely different world that bears no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world, to the world that your brain evolved to construct. Infinitely detailed, higher dimensional, filled with these beings, with these coherent narrative structure, despite it bearing no relationship to the world that your brain evolved to construct. It's like your brain is suddenly switched to speaking an entirely different language that has no relationship to English. There's no way this level of alienness could be something that my brain was just cooking up.
We're here with Andrew Gallimore. He's a neurobiologist, a chemical pharmacologist, and a writer. He's got 2 books out. Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, as you said, I'm a chemical pharmacologist originally. Was interested in, still am, of course, interested in how drugs interface with the human body, and in particular the human brain. But then shifted after my PhD, after a couple of postdocs, towards neurobiology. So try to understand how these molecules, particularly psychedelics, interface with the human brain to cause these extremely dramatic changes in the structure and the dynamics of one's subjectively experienced world. Yeah, but I gave all that up now, so I'm, well, not quite, but academically, I've extracted myself from the academic world now and focus entirely on writing. So I guess I'm a full-time writer now, author. Your
claim to fame, as it were, was developing a kind of new way. Is it a new delivery method for DMT? Is that the way to put it?
Yeah, exactly. So DMT is, to give a bit of background on what DMT is. So DMT is it's a type of psychedelic. It falls into the category of what are often called the classic psychedelics. So the most famous members of that group are LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, psilocybin from magic mushrooms. Mescaline is also a classic psychedelic, and they are unified by their mechanism of action in the brain. They bind to a very specific type of serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor in certain layers of this outer layer of the brain, the cortex. And this is what, through a kind of complex and not fully understood mechanism, this is what kind of elicits the changes in conscious experience that characterize the psychedelic state. And DMT is one of these classic psychedelics, and naturally occurring psychedelic. It's found in countless plant species, across the globe, with a very long history of traditional use by indigenous people, particularly in South America. The ayahuasca potion, which you've certainly heard of. The active component of this is DMT. But modern DMT users in the 20th and 21st century tend to use, rather than these plant-based preparations, tend to use the purified version, the pure, isolated alkaloid. And the normal mode of administration, the way that most people ingest it, is by inhalation of the vapor. So vaporize the 30 to 50 milligrams is a kind of a normal dose. 1 or 2 lungfuls is normally quite enough. And then within basically, before the pipe leaves your lips, the world will begin to change in a very dramatic fashion. A few seconds later, you will be hurtled through this rapidly changing procession of exquisitely complex and dynamic geometric imagery from behind your eyes. So normally you lie back when you do this. This isn't it isn't a dance club kind of drug to take. It's very fast. It's like being fired out of a cannon, really. I mean, it's extremely dynamic. This sense of acceleration as you're hurtled from the normal waking world. The normal waking world is basically obliterated in just a few seconds. And assuming that the dosage is sufficient, you will then break through, as it's commonly referred to. There's a sense of pushing through some kind of threshold or veil or membrane, something like that. And then you will find yourself in an entirely novel, extremely complex and dynamic and utterly alien alternate reality, populated normally, teeming often with a diverse range of incredibly intelligent, seemingly intelligent, inordinately advanced beings from some other domain. You then look around wide-eyed, shocked, appalled, astonished for a few minutes, 2, 3, 4 minutes, and that's it. And then you start to be dragged back into the normal waking world. So from the beginning of the experience, from inhalation until entering the space and then returning back to baseline consciousness, is just a few minutes. We're talking 10 minutes really. By 15 minutes you'll be giggling and shocked and shaking and all of these things, traumatized perhaps, but you will be pretty much back to sober.
When you say 10 minutes tops for the actual trip itself, does it feel like 10 minutes to the subjectively?
Well, some people describe, it's really kind of timeless. There's a sense that time doesn't apply in the same sense in that domain as it does in normal waking reality. But whether that's because there is truly a change in the kind of the temporality of this domain, whether time operates differently in this space, or whether it's simply that for most people, they're just so, by the time they kind of recognize what's going on, they're already kind of coming back. There's no time to kind of think about these things in a way, because it is so shocking. It is so utterly unlike normal human experience. It's so completely unanticipated. You can read all the Terence McKenna books and listen to his lectures and his lovely Baroque oratory on the machine elves and all this kind of stuff, but really you can't prepare yourself for what this molecule is going to do to you. It cannot be anticipated. It cannot be predicted. It can't be prepared for, really. So that's kind of the DMT experience. There's a lot more, of course, that we could get into in terms of the specifics, the types of beings and the types of spaces that people find themselves within. But broadly, this is a world that bears no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. It is completely, utterly disjoint. There's nothing. Terence McKenna used to say that nothing is taken from our world and found in this alternate world. It is a completely alien kind of space, which is why I, as a neuroscientist, find it particularly fascinating, because it's a mystery to me as to why this experience is even possible. People describe seeing higher dimensional spaces. They describe seeing these diminutive characters made famous by Terence McKenna with the machine elves, these tiny, giggling, lively beings that dance and sing and kind of jump in and out of your chest and just have a crazy old time, clearly enjoying themselves and enjoying your presence. And these beings, they will sing objects, impossible objects, into existence. So objects that not only don't exist in our world, but objects that simply cannot exist in our world. Objects that are that possess more dimensions than the three spatial ones that we're used to. So for me, as a neuroscientist, it's kind of confounding. I don't think it's trivial. Well, I will assert that it isn't trivial to explain how this is possible. So to get back to your original question, yes, the problem with DMT, if you like, well, there's two ways to look at it. It's in one respect, it's mercifully brief. Most people could not stand to be in that place. It's so bizarre for more than a few minutes. So it's mercifully brief. If you took DMT, your first time, and you had to stay in this domain for, the same length of time as you would on LSD, for example, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours or something, then that would be, I think, mind-blowing would be the word I would use here. But on the other hand, the brevity of the experience means it's very difficult to really analyze and explore the space. Once you are used to it, how can you go into that space? How can you be induced into this space and then actually do more formal analyses of the space? So looking at the geometry, looking at the spatial structure, trying to establish some kind of two-way communication between these beings within a space. Can we analyze their language? These kind of things. That's very difficult when you've only got 3 or 4 minutes after breaking through into their world. So in 2015, I think it was, I wrote to Rick Strassman. So Rick Strassman was the New Mexico, University of New Mexico Hospital, I think it was. He was a psychiatrist. Originally, he started working on melatonin. He thought that melatonin might be psychoactive in high doses, but it wasn't. So he was kind of looking for something else to do. And he was at a conference giving a lecture, and is that okay? So he was giving a lecture, and Terence McKenna was at this conference. So this was, I think, in the very early 90s. And after the lecture, Terence pulled him aside and said, "Do you know anything about DMT?" And he said, "No, but I'd like to learn." And that was it. That's when he had his first DMT experience, Rick Strassman. And then he thought, right, this is it. He gave up his melatonin work and went back to the University of New Mexico and started the unenviable task of trying to get permission from the powers that be in the United States to actually perform these experiments with this Schedule 1 drug, DMT, and he recruited 5 dozen, like 60 volunteers, injected them all with various doses, different dose levels of DMT. The ruse was that he was measuring their blood pressure and all this kind of physiological parameter, but that was the official line. But of course, really, what he was interested in was the trip reports. What were these people going to experience? And this formed the basis of his modern classic, DMT, the spirit molecule, which really recounts the experiences, the incredibly strange encounters that these 60 volunteers had when he injected them with this drug. So that's Rick Strassman. So I wrote to him because I had an idea in 2015. DMT, it's a very strange molecule for a number of reasons. So not just in terms of its effects, which are, very, very strange, but also it has these unusual, what you might call pharmacological peculiarities that aren't shared with other psychedelics. Firstly, as I mentioned, the brevity of its action. It gets into the brain. It's very rapidly has its psychedelic world-shattering, world-transforming effect. Then it's very rapidly metabolized. So it's in the brain, very quickly cleared out again. It also has this unusual property, which was first noticed back in the 60s, was that when you injected somebody with DMT, you can kind of measure the intensity of the effect. That you can have sort of rating scales for this. And what they began to notice is that you can give someone, unlike with the other classic psychedelics, you give someone, let's say, LSD, and they will have a certain, depending on dosage, a certain intensity of experience. If you then give them LSD the following day, the intensity will be very much diminished. You get this tolerance effect, very rapid tolerance effect. But with DMT, unusually, and the same applies with psilocybin, from magic mushrooms. But with DMT, it's kind of unusual in that you can inject somebody with DMT. They have, an effect that's of a certain intensity, and then you inject them 30 minutes later, and the effect is exactly the same. So there's no tolerance effect. And we now know that it's the way that when DMT binds to these particular receptors, it doesn't cause these specific changes in the receptor, which are normally responsible for kind of this desensitization effect. So it struck me that DMT, its properties, its particular pharmacological properties, would make it an ideal candidate for a technology that's been in use in anesthesiology for decades, which is called target-controlled intravenous infusion. So to break that down, so intravenous infusion simply means to infuse the drug rather than injecting kind of all at once, which is called a bolus IV injection, is to slowly infuse the drug using an infusion machine into their bloodstream. So you're constantly pumping the drug into their bloodstream. Target controlled means that what you're trying to do is to maintain the level of the drug in the brain. So the drug, when it goes into the body, into the bloodstream, it immediately is diluted by the blood. It goes into soft tissues, into muscles, into fats. It starts to be metabolized. All of these things are going on before it even gets to the brain. So you need to have a kind of a mathematical model of what's called the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, the distribution of the drug. But if you get that right, you can control the infusion rate of the drug into the bloodstream such that you can bring the brain concentration of the drug to the desired level. So in the case of anesthesiology, of course, this is going to be an anesthetic, a general anesthetic, which is a fast-acting drug they use that doesn't have subjective tolerance, just like DMT. And then you can bring them into an unconscious state, an anesthetized state, and you can hold them there, hold the patient in that unconscious state for as long as you like. And you can push them deeper when you make incisions, or you can bring them to a more shallow level so you don't disturb breathing and that kind of thing. You have much more control than you would if you simply sort of inject. People think that, they just inject you with the drug and you go to sleep. But then you're at the mercy of, the pharmacokinetics. Once the drug starts to wear off, they wake up. And if it's an 8-hour operation, then you don't want them waking up. So the idea is to maintain this steady state of the drug in the brain over time. So this technology has been developed and somewhat perfected by anesthesiology over the last few decades. So it occurred to me, well, let's just replace the anesthetic drug with DMT, right? So we can create this model, this mathematical model. I knew I could do that because I knew that Rick Strassman had blood data. So he measured the blood concentration of DMT over time after he injected them. So we had some idea of how it was being metabolized and distributed in the body. So we could fit that data to this mathematical model. We should be able to develop a protocol for inducing somebody into a breakthrough DMT state and then holding the brain DMT concentration at a fairly stable level and keeping them there for as long as you want. So it could be 30 minutes, could be an hour, could be 2 hours, could be a couple of days, right? In theory, there's no end, there's no possible end, there's no theoretical end to this. And then that brings, that opens up a whole new field of scientific inquiry, where this space, which before you can just kind of dive in and look around and then pop out again. It's kind of like the difference between scuba diving and deep sea diving, where you have a line, an air line from the boat. It means you can wander around at the base of the ocean for as long as you want, really. And that's the idea. Then you can perform experiments, you can do all of this sort of exploration, establish communication with the beings in the space, that kind of thing.
So that solves the issue that you were talking about earlier, is that the 5 minutes is like just enough for you to get situated in this space, and then it's pretty much ending by the time you start to try and confirm or explore anything, right?
Exactly, yeah. By the time you've got your kind of intellective tools in order and gotten over the disorientation, really, and the shock, you're already being dragged back out again. Unless you're very experienced. This technique, which has now been applied in humans at Imperial College London, the psychedelic research group there, which is probably the foremost pioneering research group into psychedelics in the world, really. It's already been, a paper has already come out, I think, either earlier this year or last year, I forget, showing that it was safe, that it was tolerable, that people didn't freak out and go out of their minds or anything like that. It's kind of, we're at the beginning now of the kind of realizing the potential of this what's come to be known as DMTx technology.
Yeah, that's actually how we got in touch. A monk I know said, hey, you need to check out this podcast. Or it was a kind of panel, a Zoom panel, maybe you remember that. And then they were discussing the DMTx experience, and I think they had one or two of the people who are actually taking the DMTx, and they're talking about their subjective experience and how they felt and all these different stages. They're asking them all these different questions, and that's how I found about it. So that was the panel I did. So myself and Graham Hancock were the moderators, and we had five of the volunteers. There are only, I think, 11 or 12 volunteers in that first cohort. It was just a small study, safety and tolerability kind of study. Yeah, we had 5 of them describe and discuss their experiences. And so I'm not really sure if there's more people doing ayahuasca or there's more people doing DMT, but I imagine some of the people who do ayahuasca say, oh, well, there's DMT and ayahuasca, so I kind of know what it's like. But it's kind of completely different. Is that safe to say?
Well,
DMT and ayahuasca.
Well, I mean, completely. I mean, ayahuasca is a DMT based preparation. So ayahuasca is a very old traditional plant based decoction. So you have, it's a remarkable technology, really. DMT is, unlike LSD or psilocybin, it's not orally active, so you can't just swallow it. If you swallow it, nothing will happen. We know this from the guy that discovered DMT, actually, as a Hungarian physician called Stephen Zara. He died not long ago, just 3 or 4 years ago. I think he was like 98 or 99 when he died. Albert Hoffman, who discovered LSD, was like 102, I think, 103. So if you discover a new psychedelic, you live a long time. From these two, we can extrapolate. So Stephen Zara, it's kind of an interesting story. So there are a lot of these plant-based, or a handful at least, of these plant-based, traditional, indigenous plant-based preparations that contain DMT. But before the 1950s, although these preparations are well documented, ayahuasca was well documented, these visionary snuffs. So two of the most famous ones are called Yopo and Epina. So Yopo is this fine powder which is produced by grinding up the seeds of the Yopo plant. Latin name, I'm going to butcher it, so I won't even say it. A peregrina, I think is it, but the A part is a long word. Anyway, so they grind up these seeds and they make this very, very fine powder. It looks like ground cinnamon, and they pack it into a tube that's could be like a couple of foot long or 3 foot long, a long tube, and then you get a partner. So you stuff one end of the tube into your nostril. Your friend on the other end puts his mouth over it and blows it forcefully into your skull. And it's an extremely unpleasant experience. As you can imagine, you fall back, your eyes are watering, your nose is bleeding. It's very, very, very unpleasant. And Epina is a similar thing, but it's made from the resin of certain types of trees of the Virola genus. So these have been described in the kind of ethnobotanical literature ayahuasca was first described by Richard Spruce, a British botanist, in 1852. He discovered, identified one of the plants, Banisteriopsis carpi, which is the ayahuasca vine of the soul or vine of the dead. But nobody really understood how it worked, because when people tried to kind of recreate this ayahuasca decoction, or to extract the alkaloids. First they tried extracting the alkaloids. This was kind of standard procedure. If you find a psychoactive plant, you extract the alkaloids, because 9 times out of 10 it's going to be an alkaloid that's responsible for the psychoactive effects. So a whole string of scientists, some of the brightest minds in pharmacology at the time, and chemists, were isolating the alkaloids from this Banisteriopsis carpi vine, the ayahuasca vine, and initially got quite excited when they isolated these alkaloids, which went by several different names: telepathine, banisterine, yagein, various names given by different people, but they all turned out to be the same thing, which was harmine and harmaline, which were already well known from this plant called the Syrian rue, Peganum hamala. So people are like, this isn't as interesting as we expected. We know these alkaloids, and when they were injecting them into people, animals first, of course, but they injected people with these Harmala alkaloids from this ayahuasca plant, and instead of seeing, being transported to other worlds, they became kind of agitated, somewhat drunken, vomited, nothing particularly interesting happened. And so it was like, what's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. There must be something else. There's some secret that we don't know about. And it wasn't until the 1950s when one of Richard Schultz, so Richard Schultz was the father of modern ethnobotany, the godfather, absolute legend. If there was what was they said about him? If there's a psychoactive drug he hasn't taken, it's because it hasn't been discovered yet. He didn't just discover these psychoactive plants, but he tried them all on himself and identified them and described them. So he was, absolutely central to ethnobotany in the early and the mid parts of the 20th century. So one of his students, a guy called Homer Pinkley, was in, I think it was Ecuador, but he was taking part one night in an ayahuasca ceremony, and the following day he was kind of typical botanist style. He was digging around in the cauldron where they brewed it, looking for clues, right? Because nobody knew what was in this, what was the key kind of plant alkaloid containing plant component that was responsible for the psychoactive effects, because we knew it wasn't the ayahuasca vine that had been eliminated many times over the decades prior. And he's found a few seeds and a couple of leaves or something of this plant called Psychotria viridis, also known as chacruna, and a string of other names as well. And he sent that away for analysis, and it came back as being as containing one single main alkaloid, which was DMT. So that was kind of the eureka moment, if you like, when people began to suspect that it wasn't these Harmala alkaloids, harmaline and harmine in ayahuasca, that was responsible for the effects, but it was this chacruna, this other leaf, that was responsible, that contained DMT. But the problem was, to go back to what I said before, is that DMT isn't orally active. So that was another mystery. Is like, okay, if DMT is responsible for the psychedelic effects of ayahuasca, then why is this a drink? Why? Because you can't ingest DMT orally. It was then a few years later, I think it was in the early 1960s, that people began to really look at the Harmala alkaloids more carefully. And they realized that the Harmala alkaloids are not particularly psychoactive, mildly, but not certainly world-transforming psychedelics or anything like that. But they found that these Harmala alkaloids were inhibitors of this enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which is an enzyme that's found throughout the body, in the brain, but also in the gut. Its main role is to metabolize, detoxify monoamines that enter your body. So it's a detoxifying enzyme, and dimethyltryptamine is a monoamine. So they began to realize what was actually going on here is that these indigenous peoples of South America had discovered somehow that if you added the Harmala alkaloids via the Banisteriopsis carpi, the ayahuasca vine, together with the DMT containing plant chacruna, the Harmala alkaloids in the ayahuasca vine would inhibit this enzyme in your stomach, stop it from working, which would basically allow DMT to escape unharmed and pass into your blood. So that's the ayahuasca technology.
I had heard somewhere that, so it's like this big mystery of how did they get these two obscure roots and then learn that, okay, these two specific roots, we need to boil them together. And someone had said that when they asked the ayahuasqueros, the people who know how to prepare this stuff, they said, "Oh, well, they just sing to us when the moon is out." Duh. Like,
yeah, I mean that's the explanation from them, of course. The plants told us, obviously. Now, I mean, how much do you believe of that? I don't know. I mean, there are slightly more mundane explanations, perhaps. We know that a number of groups in Amazonia still use a preparation of ayahuasca that contains only the ayahuasca vines. It doesn't contain any DMT containing plants, and it doesn't have a particularly dramatic psychoactive effects. And there's I think over 100 different admixture plants have been identified in various ayahuasca brews, depending on location. In South America, different groups will use different special recipes. So it's not crazy that they would have stumbled across at some point this particular additive, but certainly it's not known exactly how they discovered it. This minimal binary decoction, as I call it, of the ayahuasca vine and a DMT containing plant. Chacruna is the main one. There's another one called Chakrapanga, which was discovered around the same time, which also contains high levels of DMT. But really, any plant that contains the harmala alkaloids plus a DMT containing plant will give you a form of ayahuasca.
And you were saying that it's DMT is like surprisingly prevalent in all kinds of different plant species. Like I think you said it's in some types of grass the last time I talked to you. Yeah. So that's another interesting story, actually. So around the same time, so going back to Stephen Zara, I mean, he discovered that the yopo, or also goes by the name of jojoba, this powder, this snuff made from these ground up seeds, he analyzed, somebody else first analyzed the plant, the seeds, and found two alkaloids. One's called bufotenine, which, as the name suggests, was originally identified in the skin of toads. And this is nothing to do with 5-methoxy-DMT, by the way, which is a different alkaloid. It gets a bit confusing. Bufotenine isn't particularly I've never tried it, but when scientists, chemists first analyzed this yopo snuff, the powder, they found two alkaloids in there, bufotenine and DMT. Bufotenine is the one they latched onto because they already had some suspicion that it was psychoactive. And so they, in some of the earlier experiments, they were recruiting prisoners from, in those days, you could just they had kind of a scheme going on. A guy called Harris Isbell. So he worked at a hospital. I forget the exact title, but it was some institute for the study of drug abuse, this kind of thing, which just happened to be situated next to the penitentiary. Yeah, that was just by coincidence. And he had a bit of a deal going on. So basically, people would send him drugs, new drugs, anything. Yeah, he loved to inject people with drugs, basically. This guy, he was connect. If you look at the declassified MK Ultra documents, his name appears often. He was in up to his neck in this, and he would recruit these prisoners from the penitentiary, and they would be rewarded with. They were all in there for drug abuse, so they were all former addicts or current addicts who were addicted to heroin. And so they would have a system whereby if they volunteered, they would get credit. They could swap these credits for, high class heroin. Really? Wow.
Yeah. So this is well documented, and so he didn't have any problem recruiting. But he didn't care. They would volunteer, and then they would be denied breakfast and then woken up at 7 a.m. or something, and they'd be marched to the treatment room and they'd be injected with whatever drug Harris Isbell was interested in that day, and one of them was this drug bufotenine, but it didn't elicit particularly psychedelic effects. A lot of them kind of vomited, and their blood pressure shot up, and one of them went purple, the color of an eggplant, is in one of the papers from that period. But they completely ignored the other alkaloid in this jojoba, this yopo powder, which was DMT. And so Stephen Zara, having read these papers describing the effects of bufotenine, thought, no, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense that this revered traditional visionary preparation is dependent upon just bufotenine, which doesn't seem to have particularly visionary effects. So he turned his attention to the only other prominent alkaloid in those seeds, which is DMT, which he synthesized himself, injected into himself. First, he tried to swallow it, swallowed up to 1 gram, but had no effects. So that's how we first knew that DMT isn't active orally, because of Stephen Zara's first experiments. And then he was basically close to giving up, really. And a colleague says, you should probably try injecting it. It might not be orally active. So he did. He injected intramuscularly, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that was going somewhere. That was a preamble to something. Where was I with that?
Well, so we started, I was asking you if there was, if the ayahuasca experience is basically the same as the DMT experience.
Oh, yeah. And then it was about the prevalence of DMT. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, and the grass. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about, the plant sources of DMT. So after DMT was identified in the jojoba, in the apina, so these virola resins, which was another type of snuff, visionary snuff, in the chacruna, it started to be kind of to turn up basically everywhere, and in countless different plants. I mean, as long as your arm, a list as long as your arm of these plants that it was identified in. Often, identified by people who weren't working with or interested in psychedelics. They were just analyzing alkaloid content of plants, and they found DMT. And so you would kind of go into the botanical literature, and you'd find this plant contains DMT. The significance of that was lost on many of these botanists at the time, because DMT wasn't well known as a psychedelic. But in the 1960s in New Zealand, or it could have been Australia, but Antipodean anyway, these sheep farmers began to notice these very unusual neurological condition in their sheep called the staggers, which was very, very frightening, because the sheep would be perfectly healthy, and then they would suddenly start to kind of stumble around. The eyes would be kind of wild, and then they would drop dead. So these sheep farmers would wake up in the morning and then find half of their flock in various stages of rigor mortis, and it's like, we need to get to the bottom of this. I mean, it's a very expensive problem, as you can imagine, and kind of terrifying. And it was actually the culprit was found to be this grass called Phalaris aquatica in particular, but various species of Phalaris. When the sheep were allowed to graze on this plant, which was used as a grazing plant for these sheep, they would undergo these, they would die basically. So they identified this particular grass, and then they started analyzing it, and they found a number of tryptamines in this grass, one of which was DMT, as well as 5-methoxy-DMT. It turns out that it was actually a slightly different molecule called gramine, which is related to DMT, that was in this grass, that was probably actually responsible for killing the sheep. But anyway, this paper kind of languished in the literature for decades, and it was only in the early 90s when some particularly enterprising young underground chemists discovered this paper and said, hey, this is very easy to grow grass. Anyone can get the seeds. It's much easier than obtaining these other DMT containing plants. And a very famous article was published in a now defunct magazine, I guess, periodical called the Entheogen Review, describing high levels of DMT in this grass. And so that was kind of the moment when people started to think, hey, maybe we don't have to venture into the Amazonian rainforests or grow tropical plants, but maybe we can get DMT from readily available plants we can grow ourselves easily. And so Phalaris, particularly Phalaris aquatica, was kind of that first attempt at creating like a DMT for the masses, really, that anyone could produce. Unfortunately, the Phalaris grass turned out to have a number of problems. One was the presence of this rather toxic gramine molecule, which is only present in certain subtypes and subspecies, but still people were a bit wary of extracting that along with the DMT. Also, the DMT levels seem to vary a lot depending on time of day, climate, sunlight, stress conditions of the plant. It was very difficult, basically, to kind of reliably get DMT from this grass. So it kind of fell out of favor. But then in when was it? In the early 90s, I think it was. Anyway, this other plant or tree called Mimosa hostilis was identified as containing probably the highest levels of DMT of any plant thus far discovered in its root bark. And not only did it contain high levels of DMT, but it contained basically no other alkaloids. And this plant was, common as muck. It wasn't a rare plant at all. It was a practically invasive species that grew all along various countries through South America and up into Mexico. So this was a very abundant source of DMT, and once this was recognized, very quickly people realized, okay, this is kind of the holy grail, if you like, of DMT containing plants, is this Mimosa hostilis. And even now it's by far the most widely used source of DMT, which means basically anyone with, you can order a kilogram of this root bark very, very cheaply, and with a few hours in your kitchen you could, in theory, but you shouldn't because it's illegal, in theory you can extract rather pure, rather very high yielding levels of decently pure smokable freebase DMT. And so that's I think somewhat responsible for the expansion in popularity of DMT. Yeah,
I would imagine it would be more poisonous based on the name.
Mimosa hostilis.
Right.
Yeah, but fortunately not. There's another one called Acacia confusa, which also contains very high levels, similar actually to Mimosa hostilis, which is also very popular now, and that grows in more Asian areas. So it's also called, I think, what was it called? The Formosa acacia. So it grew in Formosa, which is now Taiwan. And in fact, Taiwan probably contains more DMT per square meter than anywhere else in the world, because that plant is, it's everywhere in Taiwan. The mountainous regions of Taiwan. Taiwan is covered in mountains and forests, and this Acacia confusa grows everywhere. So there's no history of use of, certainly not of DMT as a psychoactive in Taiwan, but it contains probably the richest supply of DMT anywhere in the world.
Interesting. So the discovery that kind of kickstarted more of this research into smoked DMT, or that was more of a coincidence, or just...
Well, smoked DMT is, that's again, lots of interesting stories here. But so when DMT first emerged, if you like, on the black market, on the underground drug market, this was in the 1960s, largely due to a small number of very prominent scientific and literary characters, in particular Timothy Leary, of course. He smoked, so he injected DMT in the 1960s, and William Burroughs, so the writer William Burroughs, the godfather of the beats, he actually, if we're being fair, discovered chacruna. He discovered the Psychotria viridis, the DMT containing plant, during one of his trips to South America. He actually sent the leaves of the plant to Richard Schultz at Harvard and said, "Hey, I think I've discovered the essential visionary component of yahe, or ayahuasca, as it's more commonly known." But Richard Schultz didn't really bother to look at what William Burroughs sent him until decades later, or not that many decades later, but years later anyway, after his graduate student Homer Pinkley discovered chacruna. Then Richard Schultz went back and checked and realized that, William Burroughs had actually, so really William Burroughs, the writer, Naked Lunch and that kind of stuff, he should really be given credit. He's really the father of DMT in a sense, because he started using the purified. He made friends with a British chemist in London, and he would try out the drugs that this guy was making. And he was probably the first person in the United States, or in the world really, apart from Stephen Zara, certainly the first person outside of a clinical setting to inject DMT. And he had some wild experiences. I mean, he was seeing insect people. He was describing the kind of beings that would emerge decades later. In like Rick Strassman's study, these insectoid alien beings. He was seeing those in the 1950s and 60s when he first started injecting DMT, so everyone was injecting DMT in the 60s really, but it was still very rare. It was a very rare molecule, but it was actually a guy called Nick Sand. So have you heard of Nick Sand?
No.
So Nick Sand was responsible for the legendary Orange Sunshine batch, I guess, of LSD in the 1960s. Okay. He's a very, very famous underground clandestine acid chemist, basically. And he was preparing, he also started to work with DMT and to produce DMT. And he was in his lab one day and purifying this DMT, and a few crystals of the DMT fell on a lab hot plate and immediately vaporized. And he thought, can we just smoke this stuff, And no one had thought of it, And it's not like it's the first time anyone smoked a drug. I mean, opium, tobacco, right? So it wasn't such a wild thing, but it was this moment of serendipity. And Nick Sand realized, we don't have to mess around with needles, because people don't like messing around with needles and injecting. Even in those days, it had a bad kind of image. So it was really Nick Sand who discovered that you can vaporize DMT, not really smoke, because you burn it when you smoke it. You shouldn't really it shouldn't form smoke. It should form a vapor. But anyway, Nick Sand really discovered that you could vaporize DMT. And that really changed everything. That really kind of democratized DMT. If you could get it, because in those days, things like Phalaris grass and Mimosa hostilis, they weren't known about. So to get DMT, you had to have access to a chemist who was producing it synthetically. And it was kind of rare because the market was all about LSD in those days. So most chemists weren't particularly interested in diverting their resources and time towards this, had a fairly bad reputation, DMT in those days, as being kind of the nightmare drug. Yeah, I mean, William Burroughs would sent a letter an urgent letter of warning to Timothy Leary. That's how Timothy Leary heard about it. Said, dimethyltryptamine, this is strictly the nightmare hallucinogen.
It kind of sounded like, based on what I was hearing from some people, it sounded like if you couldn't, I guess, get enough into your system to break through, then the trip was kind of just bewildering and bad, and like lacked that wonder and amazement that made it worth it. But it was like, if you could only go so far and you didn't get past through the breakthrough, then it sucked.
Yeah, I mean,
was
sucked is probably not the right word, but yeah, I mean, it would just be very, very fast, still astonishing, still shocking, but like you'd come back and go, what the fuck was that? And maybe you wouldn't want to repeat it. Many people didn't want to repeat it. But if you broke through, which William Burroughs did after accidentally injecting himself with a much higher dose than he normally used to, if you do break through, then you're into these alternate realms.
So speaking of the insectoids, I guess that's a good time. This is one of the things I wanted to ask you, was some of the commonalities. It sounds like there are a surprising number of commonalities between people's trip reports. There's the so-called machine elves. A lot of people report seeing, like you said, hyperdimensional things. Like I had even seen videos talking about people trying to map the DMT realm as if it was this consistent phenomenon that different people could go in, investigate, come back, and talk about their shared findings, something like that. Could you comment a little bit more on that? Yeah,
so it's the DMT world and its occupants is I mean, it's clearly vast and diverse, and everyone's experience is to some extent different. It's not like you're entering a single room, right, where everyone goes to the same room. It's like you're entering a vast alternate universe, really. If you dropped somebody onto a random position on Earth, an alien or something, depending on where they landed, they describe very different worlds. If they landed in the Siberian tundra, they describe a very different world than if they landed rush hour in Hanoi or something, right? So you can imagine that if there is this alternate reality, whatever it is and wherever it is, it's perhaps not surprising that people's experiences are different depending on where they end up. But what is striking about DMT is the number of commonalities. People do describe seeing the same types of beings. This is what really struck Rick Strassman when he did his study in the 90s, was that his subjects were coming back and describing these certain types of beings. They would describe like reptilian beings who are often objectionable to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent. There's one subject was described being raped. It was a guy, I think, so I'm assuming he was anally raped by some reptilian or alligator type being, right? So this is kind of rare, I think. Most of the time, people just...
Was it kind of like was he like post-traumatic stress disorder after that, and it was like a traumatizing experience for him?
Well, I mean, I don't know about the follow-up and how the months and weeks afterwards, but if you read the trip reports, I mean, one thing that I have, so I'm writing a book now, which chronicles the history of DMT and how we kind of understand it, and the neuroscience and the future, the potential future, all of this stuff. And in one of the chapters, Rick Strassman kindly gave me access to his original bedside notes that he took for all of his volunteers. So rather than just the snippets that made it into his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, I had access to everything. And some of the stories that didn't make it into the book and I won't give anything away. You have to read the book when it comes out. But it's really, they were truly appeared to be deeply traumatized by what they experienced. Something that was, this could not have happened. That's that sense of this. It's not possible. What I just experienced wasn't just strange or bizarre. It was literally impossible. There's no way this level of alienness could be something that my brain was just cooking up, which I guess we can get into. That is actually what's going on in the brain. But yeah, so a variety of different beings that people will experience. Fortunately, from the large number of studies that have been done, either in person, giving someone DMT under controlled conditions, or mining trip reports from websites and things, you can get a kind of a picture of the range of different beings that people tend to encounter on DMT, and there's certainly groups of beings. It's not, people don't experience completely. Sometimes they do actually, completely random, entirely idiosyncratic kind of intelligent beings, but often they will fall into one of a number of categories. So by far the most common type of being is a loving, guiding female presence that takes various forms, but is generally there to reassure you and to guide you. So there's this sense of being taken on a tour around the space by this very loving and reassuring female presence, often visually some kind of female or a goddess or something like that, sometimes just the sense of this presence. But then you get into the more curious kind of beings. The reptilians feature prominently, reptilian-like alien beings. Insectoids are very common. They are often involved in kind of experimentation, what I describe as like alien experimentation type experiences, where the subject finds themselves in a some kind of highly technological, extremely sophisticated, advanced domain, room, ship, whatever, and there are these reptilian type, these insectoid like mantis-like beings who are performing experiments on them, analyzing them, measuring them, doing various things to them with very sophisticated equipment.
So there's this specific correlation between the people who are seeing insectoid beings. It's usually in the context of them being some kind of experimenter, or is it like you could have it interchange where it's like, oh, I saw it was the reptiles who were experimenting on me? Or is it like more common, like if you're seeing the insectoids, they're probably experimenting on you, something like that?
Yeah, that seems to be, not exclusively, but certainly the insectoids tend to be have a more of an intelligent, technological kind of vibe, in that they're there to do business, if you like. I interviewed recently, just last year for the book, one of Rick Strassman's original participants. In the book, he's called Spiros. He described an experience where he found himself instantaneously on a gurney, laid down, and there were these 4 beings. He wasn't quite sure whether they're insectoid or they sort of had an elfish stroke insectoid kind of appearance to them. There was maybe 3 or 4 or 5 of them around him, doing things to him, measuring, probing, this kind of thing. And then there was another being who was in the background, who seemed like the supervisor. This one was truly in control, but wasn't doing the busy work. That's kind of common, that you have these, it seems to be a hierarchical system where different beings are doing different things, so often you won't see them. And then, so that alien experimentation, it's not like super common, but it's also not super rare. So I think maybe 10%, 10% of people, which is quite a big number actually, will have this kind of what's very similar to descriptions of alien abductions, sort of things that you would read in books by John Mack, who studied all of these abductees back in the 90s, really. But then you have, various other types of beings. So the machine elves are by far the most famous denizens of the hyperdimensional realms, and they are characteristically diminutive beings that are extremely lively, excited, eager to kind of show you things. They kind of come bounding from, out of the walls, really, of this space, and they're kind of, wow, they seem to kind of welcome you into this world, and they seem aware that there's, time is limited, so to speak, and they show you things, and they show you what they can do, basically. Dennis McKenna describes them, these singing impossible objects into existence, speaking this visible language, as Terence McKenna described, doing things that are utterly astounding. And they seem to be aware of that. Pay attention. This is, look at what we can do. And of course, you are completely dumbfounded because this isn't something that could happen. This isn't just a crazy dream. This is like something that is actually impossible, at doing things that could not be done in our world. So this is why I'm not satisfied with the explanation that, it's just a drug, your brain is just making it up, because there are limits to what your brain can simply fabricate.
Right. One thing I wanted to add real quick is I remember you saying elsewhere that some people might make the argument that, just everyone's just influenced by McKenna's description of this, and so everyone's seen the machine elves because they've heard of the concept, and now they're like kind of fabricating machine elves in their reports. But you said that, I can't remember the timeline, but there was some culture of people, they had discovered these creatures a long time ago, and they were, was it the Herka or the there you go. Yeah.
So it's kind of remarkable when you read the accounts of, there's a great book called Falling Sky, which describes the work of a guy called, I think his name is Dave Kopenauer. I might have butchered that, but anyway, he's a Yanomami shaman, and he describes the whole kind of process of shamanistic initiation, and what it involves. First of all, it's a grueling process that takes weeks, where the initiate, normally a young boy or a teenage boy, is basically deprived of food, is repeatedly over, all day, every day, barely sleeps, doesn't eat. They repeatedly blow this snuff, epina or yopo, into his nostrils, all day, every day. And part of this initiation process is that the idea is that you are reborn, but you are reborn is in that you are reconstituted. So these very small beings, and this Yanomami shaman describes them in great detail. He describes them as these tiny beings, extremely colorful, extremely numerous. So innumerable beings, you can never get to the end of them, he says. There's so many of them, and they're dancing and they're singing, they're playing pipes. They're clearly very jovial, lively, kind of energetic beings, and they, during the initiation process, when you call them, and they come bounding out of the forests, and they enter your chest, and they fill your chest. So this becomes their home, right? This is all, this is really the aim, if you like. One of the central aims of this becoming the shaman is your body is reborn, reconstituted, built from these beings, and they remain with you in your body, constituting your body until you until you die, really. And then when you get close to death, they leave again and re-enter the forest. So there's this mythology, if you like, or cosmology, is central to this Yanomami tradition and related traditions. Other groups have similar kind of initiation traditions and similar cosmologies. But when you read these accounts of these Hekura, you think, wait a minute, these sound like machine elves. These sound like all these elfin, these diminutive beings. And it's fascinating because you read some of the modern trip reports, and they describe that these little elves came and they were jumping into my chest and then jumping out again. And Terence McKenna also described this as well. So that is typical Hekura behavior. They enter your chest, and it's like, well, this is you could imagine, maybe these people read these accounts from traditional shamanistic mythology or whatever.
Wait, how long ago was this report of the Hekuras?
Oh, this goes back, I'm guessing, at least hundreds, probably thousands of years. I mean, this is a very old tradition that's built up over many centuries, I would say. So it's not a new idea. So yeah, I think, and then of course I'm going to tell you, in the 1950s, when Stephen Zara did his first study the very first study of DMT in other people after he injected it in himself, he recruited some doctors from the hospital where he worked, and he injected them with DMT. That was the good old days when you could just kind of
call your mate.
Yeah, exactly. So he injected these doctors and nurses with DMT, and one of them in this very first study, so one of the first people ever to be injected with pure DMT, described seeing these little tiny beings that moved around very, very quickly. I mean, it was a very brief trip report, for sure, but you think, was this the first encounter with the elves? Certainly, after someone took pure DMT, it certainly looks like it. Timothy Leary in the 1960s was describing these elfin type beings. So the idea that this is purely a McKenna effect just doesn't hold water. I mean, that's what certain people will say, is that it's all to do with McKenna. But many people describe these beings having never listened to or read anything by Terence McKenna.
Isn't that quite unique then? Because I think with ayahuasca, I guess there's some commonalities in that people say that they felt a feminine motherly presence, but it's not like there's like she consistently looks like this, or she always has this type of image or something like that. Even then, it's not even that granular, because it's like, I just felt a presence. It's just a kind of feeling that you can't even really describe most of the time. And then say with psilocybin, it doesn't really, when it comes to like the real fantastical things, it doesn't really sound like there's too many commonalities. Sure, people will say like, in lower doses, so like, colors started to change, and like the saturation went down or went up, and like my visual thing that changed. So that's like commonality, but this is very specific. Like, have energetic, self-dribbling elves jumping in your chest. That's super specific.
It is, yeah. I mean, what's important to note is that although the ayahuasca, the key component of ayahuasca is DMT, a number of people have measured levels of DMT in the blood after someone takes ayahuasca, and of course after someone takes DMT, vaporizing DMT or injection. So the level of DMT the level of DMT in your brain that's reached when you inject or vaporize DMT is about 5 times higher than is ever achieved with ayahuasca. So with ayahuasca, it's like 20% of what you get with DMT. So pure DMT really is kind of the next level. Ayahuasca tends to be much less intense. It's much slower. It's easier to work with, and that you spend, it's a more drawn out experience. you get the rise of the experience and the peak and the plateau, and then the gradual tailing off. Whereas with DMT, it's like you're there in seconds, and you reach a much higher level than you do with ayahuasca. So so there are similarities. I mean, a guy wrote to me last year who took ayahuasca, and he was hoping to see, Mother Ayahuasca, this goddess, and he was treated to something quite different, which I talk about in the book, so I won't spoil it. But he wrote to me absolutely horrified. He's got a Korean guy. He'd flown to Peru to take ayahuasca, and he thought, I didn't sign up for this. I mean, he was truly traumatized by the experience. Wow. In that he really thought that they had harvested his soul, these aliens. His experience was nothing. If there's ever an argument against the whole set, it's that the experience is entirely influenced by the setting, then this trip report is it. And he's not the only one who's experienced this kind of thing. But he was expecting to see anacondas and lovely flowing angelic motherly spirits that were going to guide him, and heal him and all this kind of stuff. As people, that's why people do it, right? They want a healing experience, and you got quite the opposite. They wrote to me and says, can you help? I'm afraid I wasn't. I mean, I did chat to him, and we kind of had a Zoom call, and I spoke to him for an hour or two, and hopefully he's okay. But
Wow. I'll share with you two quick things on that. So when I did ayahuasca, luckily I had all these expectations at first, and then I sort of threw them away after I had been hearing people saying that every single time it's 100% different from what you're expecting, so don't have any expectations. Mm-hmm. And so, I certainly didn't have this kind of angelic motherly presence guiding me through an 8-hour time of joy. I did see this kind of like ominous kind of demon creature covered in eyes trying to force me to go into this dark pit where there was all these like blackened souls kind of wailing down there. And I was like, I'm not going in there. And so they say the more you resist the trip, the longer it lasts. Yeah. And so I was just like, I'm not going in there for hours basically. And I was awake until like 3 a.m. and everyone had finished around 10 p.m. or something like that. And then the other thing is, I feel like this has happened more than once, where I want to say it was on psilocybin though, I felt like I was getting closer. Well, I didn't know what was happening, but I did have this thought of, I started to get really fearful, and I had this feeling like something is about to happen. But if I allow it to happen, then this alien mushroom presence, whatever it is, it's going to steal my consciousness and swap it with me, and then I'll never get it back. So that's exactly what this guy was scared about. But he described it as his soul, but it's the same thing, really. Right. He felt that they were fishing for his soul, and that they had taken it. And then he was like, how do I get it back? So he was. So you can't guarantee this is going to be always going to be a lovely, warm, healing experience, and people shouldn't assume that that's going to be the case, because it can be utterly horrifying. Right. And with DMT, all the more so, I think. But with DMT, of course, it is mercifully brief, so they only have you for a few minutes. Yeah. So just to finish up the psilocybin thing, and this isn't any sort of advice or anything, but I had that period of being genuinely afraid of whatever is going on, and then some part of me said, "Oh, don't worry about it, just relax." And then after that was when I had what I guess you could say is a breakthrough. It felt like ego death and basically dissolving of all available concepts, things like that. So actually on that, something about that particular trip made it really, made this analogy that you had used before make a lot of sense to me. So I don't know if I'm interpreting it right, but you were explaining how certain less powerful psychedelics may do some tweaks on an existing model and how the brain perceives the world. But then with DMT, it seems like it's instantiating an entirely new model. Could you explain that a little bit more clearly?
Yeah. So basically, the world that you experience, your subjective reality at all times, is this model. It's a model that's being constructed by your, what I call your world building machinery, which is the cortex, the outer layer of your brain, and other parts of the brain as well, but particularly the cortex. So all of the structure, the content, the dynamics, everything that you experience in your world is represented by patterns of neural activity in your cortex. So your brain is, you never know whether the world that you experience kind of maps one-to-one, so to speak, with what's actually out there. We never have access to the noumenal world, what Immanuel Kant called the noumenon, the world in itself. We never have access to that. We only have access to the phenomenon, which is the phenomenal world, the world that you experience, your subjective world. And that's a model constructed by your brain as basically as a model of the environment. Our brains evolved to facilitate our survival and reproduction in the environment, whatever the nature of the environment is, and so that's really the purpose of the world that we experience, is to allow us to navigate and survive and flourish and hopefully pass on our genes to the next generation. That's the purpose of this model. But it's always a model. The brain doesn't care whether it's true, so to speak. It has no way of measuring or knowing whether it's true. It simply knows that it works, that it's adaptive. And so when you go to sleep at night and when you dream, for example, your brain is constructing a model in the same way that it does when you are awake. It's a model that's disconnected from the environment, but it's normally a model that's built in exactly the same way. And in fact, normally it's a continuation of the normal waking world. People have studied dreaming for centuries really, but scientifically people have studied dreaming for many decades, and we know that most people dream about fairly mundane things. They dream about talking on the telephone, they dream about watching TV, they dream about doing their everyday lives. It gets weird and things shift and change, but it's the same model. Your brain is building the world, if you like, that it learned to and evolved to construct in normal waking life. The difference is that in normal waking life, your brain has access to sensory inputs from the environment, so visual information, so light, patterns of sound, etc., that it can use to kind of test its model. See, the world you experience is always the model. You never have direct access to the outside world, but you do have access to these patterns of sensory stimulation that the brain is basically using to make predictions about its model. Basically, so the world you experience in all waking life is a model that's constantly being tested against sensory information. So it's constrained, if you like, by sensory inputs, but the world you experience is always this model. So when you take a psychedelic, what's happening is the psychedelic is getting into the brain, it's binding to these particular types of receptors, these serotonin 5-HT2A receptors specifically, certainly with the classic psychedelics, and it is disrupting that model. It's changing that model. It's making the model more fluid, more dynamic, much more sensitive to sensory inputs, and that is the psychedelic state. The psychedelic state is a change in this world model that your brain is constructed. It also changes your self model. So your brain also constructs a model of yourself as opposed to the environment, as opposed to the other, So that is also disrupted as well with psychedelics, which is why you get this sense of ego dissolution. Your sense of self starts to dissolve, and also there's a loss of differentiation between yourself and the environment. So you get this what's called oceanic boundlessness, where you feel like you are one with the entire universe, because there isn't that clear differentiation between yourself and the environment. So with the classic psychedelics, with LSD, with psilocybin, with mescaline, etc., it's like a perturbation of that your normal waking world model. The model changes, and the degree to which it changes will often depend upon dosage. If you take a low dose of psilocybin mushrooms, it might be, things might seem more fluid, objects might start to shift and change their identity before your eyes, and colors might seem brighter, and there's just a change in the structure and dynamics of your experienced world. The model is changing. But with DMT, so I describe it like, it's like the classic psychedelics, they nudge the dial just out of tune a little bit. But with DMT, what happens is that the model is completely obliterated. And it's like you've found a completely new channel. The brain stops constructing the normal waking world model in its entirety. It's gone. And suddenly starts to construct this entirely novel, completely alien, really. Let's face it, that's what it is. It's a completely alien model. It's a completely different world model. Your brain is constructing an entirely different world that bears no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world, to the world that your brain evolved to construct. So that's kind of very difficult to explain. Your brain wasn't dropped to earth being able to construct a world model, a model of the environment. It took millions of years. From the moment you're dragged from your mother's womb, your brain is sampling sensory information from the environment and using it to find patterns and to start to construct objects and relationships and learning to build the world. It takes a long time. It's not an easy thing to do. And so somehow, when you perturb the brain with DMT, suddenly the brain's with crisp, incredible efficiency suddenly becomes capable of constructing these worlds that are, crystalline clarity, incredibly dynamic and intricate, infinitely detailed, higher dimensional, filled with these beings, with these coherent narrative structure. It's like the best movie you've never seen or could possibly see being created in real time by your brain. Despite it bearing no relationship to the world that your brain evolved to construct. It's like your brain is suddenly switched to speaking an entirely different language that has no relationship to English. If you think about it in terms of language, it's like your brain is suddenly speaking fluent Siberian Yupik, having never been exposed to that language. That would be confounding, of course, if that happened to a child or something, a British child or an American child. But in a way, that's what your brain is doing. It suddenly starts constructing these incredibly intricate and dynamic and highly complex hyperdimensional worlds filled with these, incredible alien beings. It's like, I'm sorry, that is not easy to explain. It's not. You can't simply say, oh, it's just hallucinations. The brain is just making it up, because there are limits to what the brain can make up. And so, I think that's the central problem with DMT is our inability to explain, in my opinion anyway, how the brain is able to construct these realities that are so different to the normal waking world with such adroit, with such effortless precision and ability. And it's a remarkable thing. Unless there is some kind of alternate sensory information input, just as the normal waking world is normally modulated and constrained by sensory information from the environment, is the brain picking up, or is information being inputted into your brain from somewhere else, from some other domain? I don't want to say where it is or what it is or its origins or anything like that. But that's what it seems like to me. It seems like you can only explain DMT if there is some alternate source of information inputs that is directing, if you like, the construction of this alternate world model.
Okay, so to follow up on what you just said, it sounds like what you're arguing is that it's very plausible that there is some sort of input or download of information. It is not your brain just being sort of tweaked and then it's like seeing things in a weird way in the same way we see dreams, because pretty much any other psychedelic and any dream seems kind of like a riffing on what we normally see. Like you'll have a dream and they're all weird and stuff, and it's like I was in a car and then the road turned into a waterfall and then we were transported into a field. But like those are all common concepts, dude. Cars, waterfalls, fields, things like that. But what you're saying is that the content of the DMT experience is just so completely removed from anything that we experience in waking life or even in the dream world, that it's almost like, where are these concepts coming from? Because it's like they're literally not branching off of anything that we could conceptualize. Like we never see things, dribble itself out of thin air and, speak things into existence, stuff like that. Yeah. And so I want to get your thoughts on that, but then I also want to ask about for example, they'll say insectoid creatures, and then people might think like, oh, okay, so DMT is just a riffing off of normal experiences because I know what an insect is and things like that. What do you think about that kind of argument?
Okay, so what I think is happening, I mean, when people do commonly describe what's often called like a download effect, and they get this very strong sensation of information flowing into their brain at a very high rate. Imagine a trillion bits per second or something like this. Something that's way beyond any normal kind of information input. There's this strong sense that there is information coming in that's directing the experience, and that's really what I think's going on. I think there is, I lean towards the possibility. I can't escape it. I lean towards the possibility that there is some kind of intelligence here that you are accessing, but I don't think. The idea that if there's a discarnate, which means, of course, without a body, some kind of discarnate intelligence that actually looks like an insect or actually looks like a reptilian, that doesn't make any sense. And so I don't think that you're seeing, I'm pretty sure, in fact, that if there is some kind of intelligence, and we can perhaps talk about what form that might take and why that intelligence might be there, but if you want to experience or interface with this intelligence, whatever it is, your brain has to build a model of it. There's no escaping that. If I'm talking to you now, my brain is constructing a model of you. I don't know what you're really like, so to speak. I don't know anything about, and you don't know anything about me either, really, but your brain is constructing a model of me. And your brain is very good at constructing models of people in particular. So when people talk about, let's take the insectoids, for example. First of all, no, I don't think that you're interacting with insectoid aliens. I don't think they're actually insectoids. I think they appear to you as insectoids, but I don't know. I don't even know if it's possible to faithfully represent this kind of discarnate intelligence in a visual form, but that's the only thing that we can do. Our brain is we are a visual species. We have to be able to construct a visual model of it. And so how does your brain, so the question then is how does your brain model this intelligence? And I think it's directed in the sense that I always say you don't break through into the DMT world. The DMT world breaks through into you. It is taking control, basically, of your world-building machinery, and it decides what you see. It is directing the visions. So you're going to see forms that, to a certain extent, are going to be perhaps reminiscent of forms that you see in the normal waking world, which kind of contradicts what I said earlier, in that nothing's taken from. So it's not entirely true that, yes, nothing is taken from this world. There are often, certainly in terms of the beings, your brain has to kind of find some way of representing these beings, or has to be induced to represent these beings in a way that makes sense to you as a living being that you're interacting with. So why they choose the insectoid, why that's such a common motif, I don't know. One thing that people often talk about, and is often what I consider to be quite a lazy explanation for DMT, is the Jungian idea of archetypes, right? So archetypes are one of the most universally known concepts, but also just as well misunderstood, I think. The archetypes, that they aren't that mysterious, really. An archetype is an inherited neurological pattern. It's basically in animals we would call these things instincts, right? So a spider doesn't need to learn how to build a web. It's born with that instinct. It contains, certain patterns, certain important ways of interacting with the environment, can be embedded. Certain programmed routines, right, can be that are absolutely essential, can be embedded in your neural architecture from birth. These deep programs, they're very deep in the brain. They're fixed. They're no good for interacting with a very uncertain, ever-changing world, but they provide you with the bare bones apparatus of how to interact with things in the world. So to kind of crystallize that a little bit, the spider building the web, right? It's something that's very important that a spider is able to do. It doesn't need to learn how to do it, right? It's so important that it's kind of embedded. It's an instinctive behavior. A newly hatched turtle will instinctively move towards the ocean, right? This is very important. If not, they get predated, right? So in humans, we also have these basic fundamental ways of interacting with the world, which also influences how we model the world as well. So we have a child from about a year old, a baby. If a snake is brought into the room, and people have done this, they will be particularly fascinated with this creature, more so than other types of creatures, living animals that you can bring into the room. Mice, to go back to smaller animals, if you raise mice entirely independently in a cage, so they've never interacted with any other mice, and they've never interacted with any other animals. You bring these mice and put them together, they immediately start playing. So this is another instinctive behavior. They roll around and tumble and stuff and all this kind of stuff. They don't need to learn to do it. It's instinctive behavior. You then drop some cat hairs. I've seen that book, actually, Effective Neuroscience by Panksepp. This is a classic, and it describes this. So you drop cat hairs into the cage. The mice who have never seen a cat will immediately stop playing, and they will stop eating, and they will be clearly nervous and fearful. It's like we need to be careful around this. We don't know what it is, but instinctively they know that this is something that needs to be careful of. It doesn't work with dog hairs, right? Interestingly, right? Yeah. It works with cat hairs, right? So these mice or rats, they don't know that this is their arch enemy's fur, but they have an instinctive response to it. Yeah. So humans, again, going back to humans, we have certain programmed ways of interacting with certain things in our environment, and normally these are important for our survival. So snakes, spiders, other types of animals, but those particularly are particularly strong, but also other humans. Right? A baby will instinctively be attracted towards its mother. Yes, it will feel a sense of warmth and comfort and safety in the presence of its mother. If you separate the baby from the mother, it cries. Yes, it gets the separation distress. And there are also, if you think about the fundamental distinction between humans, we have friends and we have enemies. So you need to know that a stranger is someone you need to keep a distance, be careful. You don't know their intent. They could, someone from another tribe, let's say. The wise old man. We're talking about archetypes here, right? The wise old man, right? What is that? Well, that's, a more senior member of the tribe, someone you should listen to carefully, someone who has lots of experience. You need to listen to what he or she is telling you, because that could be useful as well. So we have these programmed patterns of interacting with other humans and other animals. With animals, insects, it's one of basically fear and withdrawal and keeping your distance. Same with snakes. With humans, it's much more complicated. Various types of humans, if you like. So these all form part of our archetypal toolbox, if you like. So an archetype is simply an inherited pattern of neural connectivity that enables us to respond reliably and appropriately and adaptively with other beings in the environment. And it also means that we tend to build models in certain ways. So we're very good at building models of insects, right? And they have certain characteristics attached to them, right? An insect is something you need to be careful of. It has sort of an alien almost character to it, right? And again, different types of humans. The mother archetype is simply that inherited pattern of behavior, that response, the emotional response and behavioral response to the presence of your mother. So this loving figure, if you like, is basically you could see it as a manifestation, this loving female presence that people so often experience. You could say that is a manifestation of like the mother archetype, but it's not. It's simply the brain's placing this pattern onto, it's using the archetype, if you like. Archetypes are being used all the time. You have information flowing in from the outside world, and you have information flowing from these deeper neurological structures, these archetypal ancient structures as well, that are helping you to interact with the world. When you meet a new person you've never seen before who's approaching you, your archetypal patterns are kicking in. This is a stranger. I need to be careful. You need to be wary of this individual. So you're using your archetypes all the time. So even when your world model is being so dramatically altered by DMT, it's not surprising that your brain dips into its archetypal toolbox to try and find something, some kind of model that's going to work to kind of make sense of this. And it wouldn't surprise me if this intelligence was indeed drawing upon that and using what's familiar to us to kind of get across what they want to get across. If they want to reassure us and make us feel calm and relaxed and that we're in safe hands, we don't need to worry, then they're not going to show us an insectoid, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So the presence is going to be female, right? They're using that. If they want to scare you, then an insectoid is a much more appropriate model to use. So I think that's what's going on. So you certainly can't explain using archetypes. It's very simple, basic, like templates, if you like. That's all an archetype. It's a basic template for how to build a certain type of human or build a certain type of animal. That's all it is. It certainly can't explain these extremely dynamic and hyper complex behaviors and geometries and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I don't dismiss the archetypal explanation, but I think it's only it's just the surface level of what's going on there.
So the insect or the reptiles, it's more like it's the best token that was available. Kind of like you're making a diorama and you only have Legos, and then someone says like, that's not Jesus, that's a Lego man. It's like all I had was Lego man.
Yeah,
so
right.
That's what I had to use.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So that's basically, I think, what's going on. You know, whether it's your brain drawing on these archetypes to try and make sense. I think this is what best fits, you know, the kind of experience that I'm having here, the kind of entity I seem to be interacting with, or whether it's actually the intelligence that's directing this, that is using these types of models. Because I think ultimately it's the information coming in, that's the intelligence that's actually directing the type of experience that you have. Mm-hmm. Sorry, it's complicated and a bit difficult to understand, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense for sure. It's or at least what I'm getting is it kind of sounds like let's say whatever is directing the DMT experience is just using the limited resources that is available in the human brain's world building toolkit kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, you can't experience a world that your brain can't construct. Right. You know, so whatever. You know, I describe the DMT world as a directed world, as opposed to being there's three types of worlds. A sensed world, which is a world that is being modulated by information from the environment. This is the normal waking world that you're experiencing. A dreamt world is where you disconnect the information during sleep. This is a world that your brain is using the object models and the world models it's developed over the period of evolution, development, and experience to construct the dream world, which tends to look a lot like the sensed world, except being generally more dynamic and ever shifting and unstable. And then you have what I think the DMT world is, which is a directed world where the information is coming. When you take DMT, you're gating the flow. The brain enters this what's called a state that's close to criticality, which basically means that it's much more fluid and dynamic and malleable. So just like heating a piece of glass, glass is very rigid, but when you heat it up, it becomes much softer, and you can glass blowers will create these beautiful shapes out of glass, but only when it's hot. And so with DMT, your brain reaches this very hot state, so to speak, where it's much more fluid and dynamic, and in my opinion much more susceptible to being commandeered by this agent, this intelligent agent, whatever it might be or wherever it's from.
One thing that I just thought of, maybe you've heard this before, but another thing I was thinking of is, so like you said, it's like you take DMT and then your existing model is completely obliterated, and then you're going into a new model, right? Do you think, for example, it could be the case that while you're under the influence of DMT, you are utilizing this model, but then once you come off of it, you disengage from that and re-engage into the old model, so you can only make sense of that memory in terms of this human model that you have? Like, so maybe you could be experiencing the whole DMT thing in all its glory, but then when it comes to go back and remember it or report it, like you can only use it, speak about it in terms of this previous model. I guess that could be something that could be never confirmed. So
this is a very good point, and you're absolutely 100% right, is that memory is always a process of reconstruction. A memory is when you remember something, you're reactivating to a certain extent patterns of the same pattern of neural activity that occurred during the experience. So if you want to remember, and this is why DMT is so difficult to remember, is that if you want to recall the experience, your brain has to find a way of kind of reactivating that experience in the absence of DMT, and that seems extremely difficult for the brain to do. So it's almost like you have to kind of form like a lower dimensional projection of that higher dimensional experience after the DMT trip ends. So you're trying to find a way to kind of reconstructed in your brain such that you're remembering it, recalling it, so you can describe it in the absence of DMT. And so that does open, exactly as you said, that the question of, is it a true memory? Is your brain trying to make sense of it after the fact? But actually during the experience itself, maybe it was completely different. And it's actually your brain is using these archetypal structures and stuff to try and make sense after the experience. So actually it's not a true memory, whatever that might be, but actually in a sense a reconstructed memory, a lower dimensional projection of the original experience.
Interesting. Okay. To switch gears a little bit, I was curious if you've spoken to, let's say, some monks or Buddhists who on the topic of DMT.
I haven't. Certainly, I know a little, like, if you look at the, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, which is very rich with, I was very interested in Buddhism, 20 years ago. Actually went on a 2-week-long retreat somewhere in the UK, which was completely different to what I was expecting, by the way, but it was a variation of Tibetan Buddhism, or actually Vietnamese version of Buddhism, which is, I think, closely related. But they have these, that they love these gods and characters that populate these different worlds, and they describe going to different lands, after death, for example. They describe going to the Dakini land, I think is one that rings a bell, which is a land filled with these strange creatures, and so there's you can't help but think, is it possible? Because we're not just talking about Buddhism here, but the idea of there are other realms that are populated by beings that are more intelligent and more wise and more powerful than us. That it's certainly not restricted to Buddhism. You can go into Hinduism as well, and you can find the pantheon of all these different gods. Often very, very strange creatures. So I think one is forced to confront the possibility that perhaps these Buddhists, perhaps in the past, perhaps not so much now, I don't know, were able to access these domains through other means. I think DMT is certainly the most efficient tool for gating access to these very strange domains, but there's no reason to assume that there couldn't be other techniques, and that certain people, certain individuals who are very well trained over time can access these. They have to come from somewhere, right? You have these rich cosmologies of entities and deities and gods and goddesses and strange creatures, and it seems, I don't know, perhaps slightly insulting or patronizing to say, oh, this is just somebody cooking it up and just making it up. It seems like it must have some kind of origin, though, some kind of experience that underlies that these people are actually having access to these places, and that maybe the modern human has become more and more disconnected from that alternate reality. We've our brain has become much more, if you like, rigidified. It's probably not the right word, but you get the idea, is that we've cemented ourselves in this very mundane, really, slice of reality, and convinced ourselves that this is it. With a great degree of hubris, that we have, this is it, and this is all there is, and there's nothing else to see. And if you see something else, then it's just a hallucination, and that this is just, you're deluding yourself if you think it's anything more than that. So certainly, modern DMT users are probably not the first to discover these kind of realms, or even the indigenous peoples of South America. It probably goes back thousands and thousands of years. And I do entertain the idea that perhaps that we have become more disconnected from these other realms.
I think one of the reasons why these more fantastical states are so difficult for people to imagine occurring sober is that it seems like when people are having these mystical experiences, say on a very long meditation retreat, that much of what is necessary to get to a position to where you can even start on the work necessary to get there is like a long, dramatic dopamine detox, especially for the modern person. So it's maybe, let's say in the past when there was no computers, TVs, radio or anything, it's like half the work of the meditation retreat was already completed for the average person. And so they could just go in, and then it would be a lot more feasible for people to go speak to whoever's teaching the meditation and then actually get somewhere in, say, a meditation retreat and say, oh, okay, hey, there is something a bit, there's a kind of mystical realm.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, we are, in the modern world, we are bombarded, literally our brains are bombarded with sensory inputs all the time, and ever more so, exponentially more so in the last few decades. It's constant. We're being bombarded through screens mainly, and media, of course, and this is literally shaping our reality. And constraining our reality. Sensory inputs constrain your world model. And so it's literally directing, in a sense, how you view the world, and disconnecting from that, by going on a retreat or something. You, as you said, you're doing kind of half the work. You are removing that source of sensory inputs, removing that constraint, and then it's simply a matter of getting yourself into the right neurological state, perhaps, that would allow these alternate sensory inputs to take control and for you to experience these alternate realities.
Have you ever heard of the concept of stream entry or stream enter or something like that?
No.
So there's several different types of Buddhism, let's say sects of Buddhism. And I think what Americans are most familiar with is Zen Buddhism, which doesn't really have any sort of a map that leads to enlightenment. It's something that'll happen, but if you want enlightenment, then that's an oxymoron, or that's a paradox. So, let's not talk about it.
Yeah.
Or anything. And however, there are, I can't remember the name of the one most associated with the map, but there's this kind of 4-path model where there's 4 stages to awakening. And so you do some insane amount of meditation, and then you have what's called a cessation experience, where basically as you're doing the meditation, the mind gets quieter and quieter and quieter until basically it kind of sounds, to use your analogy, where you have gotten to a point where you've completely disengaged the model, the world building model, and you are in a point of basically nothingness. You don't start a new model, but you have completely disengaged this one, and then there's this kind of short cease in consciousness. And then when consciousness boots back up, you see the model construct itself, and seeing the model construct itself leads to this massive insight of you can kind of see how the building blocks are put together, and you see the trick, and you see how the self is built, and you're like, wait a minute, that's not what I've been told. And then you have this kind of like the biggest epiphany imaginable by a person. And so at that point, there is said to be a permanent shift in the person's consciousness. And then, but that's only the first stage. And then you do it again, but to I guess to a more intense degree. And then you do it again and you do it again. And then the fourth is the point when you actually say someone is quote unquote enlightened. But what's interesting about this is they have actually been doing brain scan research on people who have claimed to achieve these different stages. And there's this one person in particular who I interviewed. His name is Delson Armstrong. He is alleged to have achieved the 4th stage, and they put him in the brain scanner, and they're like, we don't know if he's achieved this mystical thing, but his brain is, something about his brain is totally different, to where he can do this technique where it's basically he can at will, whenever he goes into that cessation stage that I said, where it's basically you've disengaged the model. And so he'd do the technique, and they're scanning his brain while he's doing it, and they're like, we don't know exactly what he's doing, but it looks like the brain suddenly goes into a state akin to, say, anesthesia, like ketamine. Like it basically looks like he can willingly make the brain go into a state that is similar to ketamine. So what I'm getting at is I'm wondering if the DMT experience would be any different for these kinds of people who have achieved this kind of permanent change in their brain configuration. Is that anywhere on your horizon, or?
I think it would make for a great study. Yeah.
Okay.
If you could get a number of these individuals, I don't know how rare they are. They sound kind of rare.
It's incredibly rare.
Incredibly rare. So if you could convince, at least one, if you could have convinced at least one to take DMT under controlled conditions, and also measure their brain activity and see how do they differ from someone who is, who doesn't have that, who isn't the sub-enlightened kind of normies, then that would be great to look at. But it's interesting. You mentioned ketamine. Have you heard of John Lilly?
Oh, that sounds very familiar.
Dolphin whisperer.
Oh, okay. He did some insane amount of ketamine, right?
He did insane amounts of ketamine. I mean, he was one period in his life, he was injecting it every couple of hours. Like he would sleep. But the only time he wasn't injecting ketamine was when he was sleeping, basically. So, but he started. He invented the flotation tank, the sensory isolation chamber. Not a lot of people know that. But initially, it was kind of quite a complex thing, and you would have eye shades and on a bed or something, like a gurney or something, and it was very difficult to isolate all the senses. And then he discovered that if you could float in salted water that would provide buoyancy, you can enclose this chamber that was completely dark. You could create a perfect sensory isolation chamber. And he found very, very quickly that after lying within this sensory deprivation chamber in this flotation tank, he was expecting to see nothing, or a void of some sort. But that's not what happened. Again, the brain stopped constructing its normal world model, and it started to construct another world model, and he found himself in these extremely technological alien domains and interfacing with what he described as an alien intelligence. Then he started taking ketamine. Initially, he started with
LSD. That was sober.
Initially, right? He started taking LSD inside these tanks, and that kind of upped the level of the experience. But then this was about the time when the government was cracking down on LSD, and so he was unable to. He had to send all of his LSD back to Sandoz, and he needed an alternative. And a friend of his said, you should try ketamine. That might do the trick. And so that's how he got involved in ketamine, and he started taking ketamine and going into the flotation tank, and he was interacting. He built this whole cosmology of these levels of alien intelligences that he was interacting with and communicating with over many years. He was eventually sectioned because he called the White House and said that there was aliens were planning to kill the president or something like that. So the police came and took him off and put him in a mental institution. So people think that he's kind of mad. But, yes, he took it further than anyone I can think of, certainly, with his ketamine use. But he's describing interacting with advanced non-human intelligences, just as people who take DMT. And in a sense, it's perhaps not that surprising. You cut off the sources of sensory input which normally constrain and basically force your brain to construct a certain model of the world as a model of the environment, and then you allow it to kind of reset, right, in a sense, and begin constructing an alternate model. And whether that is being directed by some kind of other intelligence, who knows? But I certainly wouldn't dismiss the idea that John Lilly was, in fact, interacting with some kind of discarnate advanced intelligence that from some other place.
What happened to John Lilly after he got sent away?
Well, I mean, he was, he wasn't a section permanently, and he continued taking ketamine until the end, I think. I mean, this guy was absolutely committed, and he did some really important work. I mean, this guy was, he published so many academic papers. I mean, he was a proper buttoned down academic neuroscientist, physician, before he got involved with this weird stuff. And he did amazing work studying the language of dolphins as well. Yeah.
So the ketamine had nothing to do with the dolphins?
Well, he did give dolphins LSD, and they all had very nice trips, so he says. I don't know how he measured that, but they all had good experiences. I mean, this was in, I think, the 1960s. He was speaking at conferences about giving LSD to dolphins, and but yeah, he believed that they were a higher intelligence, the dolphins, which that may well be the case, certainly higher than humans, and that we could learn to decode their language, and he made great headway in that, in kind of trying to understand the language of the dolphin. So he was a very important figure, and often discredited or dismissed as being just a complete wacko. And he might, to a certain extent, he was. But you kind of need that. You need to take these ideas and run with them. You need to be a little bit unhinged, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
You know what it reminds me of is these speedrunning communities on the internet of people who they're playing some video game and they figure out the most ridiculous glitch where, like, if you take 5 steps this way, jump 3 times, and then use this item, and then use that item, but then you switch to a different, like, just the most ridiculous sequence of events leads to some sort of bug so that they can, like, shave down the time it takes to complete the game by, 5 minutes or something. And they're doing all this crazy stuff. And it's like, how did you ever figure this out? Right. It's like, I just did a bunch of weird stuff, and then something happened. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So you need that. People, scientists are often very much, they paint themselves into a corner, in a sense, in that what experiments are permissible and which ones are not, and which, what is the framework under which we try to understand a phenomenon. This is kind of codified in the kind of the orthodox paradigm of modern neuroscience and physics or whatever. So you need people to push outside of that. I mean, without that, you wouldn't have people like Einstein, or Copernicus, right? This kind of thing goes back, so it's not a new thing. You need people who are willing to say, actually, I'm going to take a different approach. I think, I'm going to entertain what for most people seems like a completely insane idea, which is the idea of communication with the discarnate alien intelligence, which is something that which I do. And there aren't many that will do it with a straight face and actually take it seriously. There's a lot of mystics and people who approach it from the kind of what's often disparagingly called the kind of the woo edge of things, right? Yeah. People say, oh, it's demons and angels, and what's the astral plane? And for me, it's never particularly satisfying, because you're so far. I always tried to keep one foot in, established evidence-based neuroscience, and then reach out into alternate territories and say, how far can we push this? Can we use the modern paradigm of neuroscience to at least show why the DMT experience in particular is so difficult to explain. And if you can do that, which I think we can, I mean, that's what I've been trying to do. I've not been trying to convince people for the last decade or so that the DMT world is a real place, or that we are interacting with real intelligences, but simply to convince people that actually it's not very difficult, it's not easy to explain, or in fact it's almost impossible to explain away these experiences using the neuroscientific paradigm that we have at our disposal, which is why we need to start to think outside of that paradigm and start to consider things that most people would think of the unthinkable, think of things that most people would consider to be beyond the pale.
Right. Something about this reminds me of how you have to use the right words, or you'll be, you'll be judged in a particular way. So, for example, you could have one person. It's been known for a long time that epilepsy is cured by fasting, but you can only fast for so long. But something about fasting seems to stop epileptic seizures. Mm-hmm. And so it used to be said that, well, the person is possessed by a demon, and now they're shaking around because of the demon. And we figured out that the cure for the demon is to fast in like a secluded room somewhere. If you said that, you sound nuts. But you've arrived at the correct solution. Yeah. And then now, of course, we say, oh, well, they have epilepsy. Yeah. And then something about the fasting works on the GABA receptors in the brain or something like that. But it's like, wait, we arrived at the same solution. What's wrong with my explanation? Kind of thing. It's what I mean to say is like there's like a limitation of putting these ineffable experiences into words, right? So
yes, that's always the problem. To F the ineffable. Yeah. To English the unenglishable. This is what we're trying to do with DMT, and yeah, I think with DMTx, this extended state technology, I think that's going to be much more straightforward. And you can start to ask questions like, are the correlations? Can you have two people who are given DMT at the same time in different rooms completely independently, and can you find correlations between their experiences in real time? So are they going to the same place, or are there correlations between their neural activity which would suggest some statistically significant correlation between their experiences? These sort of things can be done now, and I think are being at least thought about and planned places like Imperial College London. So we might be people who dismiss the DMT world and its inhabitants as mere hallucination, figments of the brain. I think they might be in for a bit of a surprise in the next few years, hopefully.
Right. I think that's a good place to stop. Maybe you should tell people about your book, or
yes,
this one, or would you prefer to advertise the upcoming one?
Yeah, so this one. Where do I put this? Here?
Let's see, is it on screen?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's perfect.
I don't have I can see it. There we go. My eyes aren't very good. Yeah. So this is my second book, Reality Switch Technologies. So this is, in my opinion, the kind of the most detailed and comprehensive guide to how psychedelics, not just the classic psychedelics, but salvia divinorum and the tropane alkaloids and even ketamine, how these psychedelic drugs, how they interface with the brain, and how they how they perturb the brain and alter the structure and dynamics of your world, and how we can use these drugs to kind of explore alternate models of reality, this kind of thing. So if you're really interested in understanding at a deep level, from the level of molecules, brain cells, networks of brain cells, the whole brain's world building machinery, all that stuff, and how it's changed by psychedelics and what that might mean for us as a human species, then Reality Switch Technologies is definitely the book I would recommend, as recommended by Hamilton Morris, no less. But yeah, my next book, which has a title, but I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, is going to be published in early summer, I think, next year. So it's just in the final stages of editing that now with my editor over in New York. And that will be the first book published by one of the big 5 publishing houses that is entirely focused on DMT. the history, the science, the mystery, what it all means, the kind of future that we can look towards, all of this stuff. So that's the book to look forward to, hopefully. But you'll have to wait for another, almost a year.
Wow, okay.
But you can also find me. So I have a website, buildingalienworlds.com or alieninsect.net. That'll take you to the same place, where you can find links to buy my books or watch my interviews, read many of the articles that I've written, that kind of thing. My Twitter, Alien Insects. So that's where I generally hang out and post a lot. I also have an Instagram, which is the same handle, but I don't use it as much. I think that covers it.
Great. Okay. Well, Andrew, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Joe.